why do we tend to hear this word creation and think the beginning of the world only? What has gone on in our intellectual development to reach that point?
Yeah, I think that's great, because I mean, before I answer the question, I'll say this: when you look at the Bible, creation, you framed it well. It's a theme that goes from Genesis to Revelation. It really is the story that God is doing. So the Bible doesn't facilitate that. I think what it goes back to is the origin debates, and specifically the conflict between views of creationism and evolutionism. And those two views helped us. I use the language in the book. The Scopes trial, right, limited the scope of Scripture's story in our minds. We hear creation, we think origins. But in reality, creation, while it's inclusive of the very beginning and even the how, the theme of creation in the Bible is much bigger and broader in scope.
So what does it encompass then, if it's not just about the how?
Yeah, ultimately, a couple thoughts. One is simply that we are in a scientific world. And in the last couple centuries, science has dominated, not theology, and that has infiltrated even into the church. So sadly, Christians, when they think of creation, are probably tutored more by the questions or the positions of someone like Darwin than they would be someone like Jesus. Right? They're not even thinking of the Bible's winking and nodding and prodding with creational themes that are not just in Genesis, but are throughout the biblical story. But the reality is Genesis 1 and 2, if we want to talk about that kind of origin type text, is answering not one question, but four. And I think this is really important for your listeners to get, because usually when we come to Genesis 1 and 2, the question we think Genesis 1 and 2 is answering is how. How did it come about? What was it? Was it a 24-hour day, or how do we understand the week and the nature of the creation itself, of the creation event itself? As much as that's an important question, and there's entire ministries, right? Answers in Genesis is literally focusing on the how question. Those are worthwhile projects. Those are inclusive of what the Bible's trying to do. But I would like to argue that the biblical text is not even primarily answering that question. Rather than just answering the how question, it's also answering the who, the what, and the why. And when you think of the who, the what, and the why, it's orienting the reader to who God is. And even significantly, like in Genesis 1:26 to 31, is who is male and female, made image bearers, made in God's image, and why did He make the world, right? And what did He make? That it's good, that it has a purpose, that it has a agenda and a trajectory that ultimately culminates in the work of Jesus Christ and ultimately the new creation. So I think we almost need, after a couple hundred years of equating creation with origins, or being tutored by Darwin instead of by disciples of Jesus, we need to remember the how question is fair and it's worth discussing, and the Bible talks about it. But it also talks about who God is and who we are. It also talks about why He made the world, and also about what it is made of and what it's for. And those questions have a lot of ministry payoff for the daily life of every Christian.
I love the inclusive set of categories you just offered us, because on the one hand, it's true that the Bible is filled with historical data, right? It's trying to tell us things about what happened, when, and how. It does that constantly, but it's not only that, and it would be a serious mistake to reduce it to that. And I see this at work even in other places of Scripture, where you look at the Gospels, for instance, and the way we have a, I guess, default tendency to read those is as like journals or diaries or chronicles, blow by blow, play by play chronicles of what happened when, right? And the things that the Gospels report actually happened. They're real events. But the organization of the Gospels is very distinct from what you might find in a newspaper or a memoir. They're works of literature. They're selective in the things they highlight and how they highlight them and when they highlight them and the way they order those things, right? So that you can produce a harmony of the Gospels to try to reconstruct something like a timeline. But in reality, I mean, these things touch on the birth of Christ, and then they skip 30 years to his ministry, essentially, right? With the exception of Luke, gives us one little story in the middle, and it's like that should clue us in that something else is going on here besides just reportage of events, right? And the same thing seems like it's happening, not just in Genesis, but throughout Scripture, where we're reading about creation, but it's much more than just a here's what happened when. It's a here's why it's happening. Here's who is active, and here's what's going on.
Well, and to your example of the Gospels, let me show you how the Gospel of John, to give example, connects with this creation theme so beautifully. Without denying at all that the Gospel of John and all the Gospels are absolutely giving eyewitness historical accounts. But to your point, it is communicating, God is communicating to us with beautiful intentionality. For example, in John 18-20, the scene of Jesus's arrest, betrayal, trial, crucifixion, and resurrection. In those 3 chapters, creation is everywhere. Let me tell you where. In literally the first verse of John 18:1, it mentions that that Jesus arrived at a garden. Now, it never names the garden. Now, it never mentions what again. Now, everybody would probably know Gethsemane, right? Because other Gospels would say that, but John doesn't name it. And you might think, well, that just could have been happen chance. But actually, John is very intentional about what he does not name. If we hadn't had the other Gospels, we'd have never known from John who the mother of Jesus was, because John is always contrasting Jesus' mother with his father. Who is the blind man? Who's the lame man? Who is even the beloved disciple? Now, while some of there's clues in the text about those things, my point is anonymity in John is always theologically significant. So in this scene of Jesus in a garden being betrayed, rather than wanting you to think of a historical garden, John is inviting you to think of the biblical garden, where God, in an earlier time, was betrayed in a garden. Well, the scene moves to the crucifixion, and in John 19, the very last or second to last verse, 1941, I'm doing it by memory, right after Christ dies, literally after he dies, the text immediately says, and there was a garden nearby. Now, why mention a garden? Because it wants you to think of the biblical story as the story of this developing garden image. If in the first garden in Genesis, death came out of life, in the second garden in John, life comes out of death. And then, of course, probably most of your listeners, or many, will be familiar with John 20, where Jesus is resurrected, Mary Magdalene sees him, and the narrator lets you know what she's thinking. She sees the resurrected Jesus, and the narrator adds in, again, I mean, she probably had tons of thoughts that the narrator doesn't tell us, but the narrator wants us to know that she assumed he was the gardener. And in one sense, he's not the gardener, he's Jesus Christ. He's not just an employee for the city or something, right? In another sense, in light of developing story that started John 1:1 in the beginning, and has entirely been tracking Old Testament festivals and realities, and the creation theme in John 18-20. In another sense, he is the gardener. Like Romans, he is the second Adam, right? And the reader is supposed to see that. So notice how creation theology is not just about origins. It's actually about the gospel story. Like, if you're going to understand the work of Jesus Christ, you need to understand that God's creation project always was to filtrate through him and the work on the cross for him to accomplish the work that he was building, the garden that he's cultivating, which is including our very own world.